Hello, welcome to this episode of the Brexit Central podcast. I'm Darren Grimes, and in this episode, I'll be talking all things Scotland, discussing the likelihood of Scottish independence post-Brexit, the opportunities that Brexit presents Scotland, and the contradictory position of Nicola Sturgeon's desire to take back control from Westminster, only to hand those powers back on a Euro-lined silver platter to Brussels. Joining me to discuss all things Scotland is Ross Thompson MSP. Ross has been a Conservative member of the Scottish Parliament for North East Scotland since May 2016 and played a part in the Scottish Vote Leave campaign. Also joining me is the editor of Brexit Central, Jonathan Isaby.
Gordon Brown came out the other day saying, there can be more powers devolved to Scotland post-Brexit. What do you envision that final deal looking like? What do you think it is along the lines of the Gordon Brown argument? That's the case that should be made. Fisheries policy, agriculture, more finance devolution. What is it that you think will be retailable to the Scottish people to make them feel a bit more at ease with Brexit?
People like Gordon Brown are very late to the party, and it's where if you really believed in this, where were you when we were fighting for it during the European referendum, and we're telling people that this could be one of the biggest benefits of Brexit was to empower our Scottish Parliament. And for me, it makes sense that in areas where we already have devolved competency over rural affairs and agriculture, for example, the environment and transport, the powers that Brussels hold in those areas should absolutely come straight to the Scottish Parliament. And in fact, it clearly would, because within the Scotland Act itself, it details what is reserved, what is devolved. So clearly for me, anything that comes under those competencies should automatically come to the Scottish Parliament. And I find it an extraordinary argument that Nicola Sturgeon is taking us to the brink of a referendum to absolutely ensure that these decisions are still taken by Brussels bureaucrats rather than herself, her own government and her own MSPs. I don't know what kind of nationalism that is, but to say that you want to take all these things back to then give them all away is something which is clearly dividing the independence movement itself in Scotland.
I guess it suits Nicola Sturgeon quite well to have someone else to blame for her failures in, whether it be education, health policy, all the rest of it.
Fishing is obviously a big issue in the North East of Scotland where you represent. Are you confident that the British government is going to seize control completely of that area and not in any way use British and indeed Scottish fishermen as pawns in a negotiation? Because I think there's been a bit of disquiet, certainly amongst Brexit Central readers, that we haven't heard very much from the government on this so far.
Interesting enough, and it comes up naturally from the fishermen that you speak to. If you're in the Dolphin Cafe having some fish and chips with them over something that's freshly caught, they will tell you how they feel. And that is in the 1970s, they felt they were absolutely sold out, and they were. And the SNP seized on that, and the SNP embedded themselves into the fishing community because they kept telling fishermen how hard done by they'd been, how Brussels didn't work in their interests, how the common fisheries policy was devastating to their communities, and we have to get rid of this. Yes, folks, this is the SNP that's been saying it. Now we have this extraordinary situation where the UK is now leaving the European Union, and thank goodness the common fisheries policy and everything else that's associated with Brussels. And there is that opportunity now to have our own sustainable fishing policy, to take back control of our waters, and fishermen are eager to seize it. Yeah, it's the SNP that are consistently telling them that actually no, it'd be better off if this was still determined in Brussels. It's completely untenable. Fishermen are frustrated. They're really angry. Every time they hear Nicola Sturgeon stand up and say, we're better off in the EU, they say, well, not for me, not for the coastal communities in Banff and Buchan, not for the fishermen that operate out of Peterhead and Fraserburgh. It's absolutely not. And that is putting the SNP under real pressure. This is our opportunity to take back control of our waters. This is our opportunity to regenerate and rejuvenate our coastal communities. And rather, they would take us to the brink of this referendum to ensure that didn't happen. In terms of the position of the UK government, I speak to the Scottish Fishermen's Federation and Bertie Armstrong, who is the chief executive of that, and had him recently into Parliament, and he attended one of the debates that we were speaking of. And I know that they are happy with the direction of travel that the UK government has taken, and they've been very critical of Nicola Sturgeon talking about independence at this time as well, saying it is the wrong time to be talking about it, and the wrong argument to be having at this time. But there's still a job to do to make sure we keep the pressure up. Now, given that Andrea Leadsom and George Eustace were Brexiteers and who understand those arguments and they're in that department, that does give me confidence that they understand the real issues because they've heard it from the fishermen directly. But it's up to all of us who voted to leave, up to all of us who want to see the best deal for our fishermen to keep the pressure up. And I do that in the Scottish Parliament as often as I can with the Scottish Government, because if there's anyone that's going to sell out fishermen, it ain't Theresa May, it'll be Nicola Sturgeon.
Alex Salmond in the papers this morning talking about how an independent Scotland would join EFTA, even though Nicola Sturgeon yesterday was saying they want to be fully paid up members of the European Union. So already there's sort of, diverging opinion within their ranks.
Nicola Sturgeon's in an incredibly difficult position, and also very hypocritical, is that she will no doubt start coining a phrase. We heard it in First Minister's questions just last week, which is "we want to take back control." So well done, guys. And it was a very powerful campaign to leave the European Union. And Nicola is going to be saying to Scots up and down the country that we need to leave a single market, which is 4 times more important to us than the EU. We should leave that to be part of the EU single market. That rather than taking powers back to our Parliament and having more decision making made in Scotland, that no, forget that. We should have that run by Brussels. And then again, strangely enough, she wants to do all of this to ensure that Scotland's in the European Union. But her mechanism to do it takes us out, and as one of their own MPs, Ailey Whiteford, admitted onto WTO rules, she said, well, that's not really good for Scotland. So strangely enough, Nicola wants to cause more damage in the process, and she has no clue what the alternative would be. She says she wants to be within the European Union, and that's been long-standing party policy. But if you speak to some of our colleagues in Europe, the Spanish, for example, that's just not going to happen. Even in Belgium, they have their own issues. They're not going to want to see an independent Scotland join the European Union. So what do we have? So do we have an EFTA agreement then, where Nicola criticised that herself, and I quoted her in the chamber saying that how you have therefore little influence, and why would you want to be part of something so daft? Yet this is now something the SNP are proposing. So you come right out of the United Kingdom. You could come out of a deal which we have with the European Union that works for Scotland through trade, and so you want us to be part of an organisation where yes, you'd have access to the single market, but you'd have no say in it whatsoever, and literally everything would be determined by Brussels. I don't see how that is independence. And I think Nicola's going to have a really hard time trying to convince not just the rest of us about this argument, but her own side about that argument. It was absolutely fascinating. Jim Sillars, who is the former deputy leader of the SNP and a big wig in the independence movement, he helped lead the independence movement in 2014, has come out and said that he could never vote for independence on that premise. So this is someone who got into politics to secure an independent Scotland, who's fought all of his life for an independent Scotland, who used all of his energies to try and get an independent Scotland in 2014, and he is saying that he cannot vote for independence under Nicola's premise, particularly if it means joining the European Union. Why would you want to give away all your powers and sovereignty back to Europe after reclaiming it, in his view? It makes no sense. And it's not just on his own. He speaks for 400,000 other SNP supporters. I think there's a huge contradiction in Nicola's argument, particularly when you look at just the cold facts. If you want to just look at economics and what is best and best for Scottish business, then it is remaining within the United Kingdom, without a shadow of a doubt. And when you hear SNP ministers say it is economically devastating for Scotland to come out of the European Union, you're like, well, goodness me, how much more worse would it be for Scotland to come out of the United Kingdom, who is our growing market and our largest market? And not just that, it is also our friends, our neighbours, our family, and the shared history we've had over 300 years, which you do not have with a political organisation that's only existed for 40.
But if you go back to the argument of, well, Brexit has changed things, it's a material change, and that it was in our manifesto and all of the rest of it. Alex Salmond has said throughout the Trident debate that was a reason to have another independence referendum. Boris Johnson potentially becoming Prime Minister would be another reason to have a second independence referendum. So do you think this whole idea that Brexit has changed things, that really is just opportunism, isn't it?
They would have used anything to take independence back and put it firmly back on the table. So, like you said, if Boris Johnson had become Prime Minister, Alex Salmond had said just that it would have caused independence. Alex Salmond also said that if Donald Trump had become president, he would have moved to Antarctica. I'm really disappointed he hasn't kept that. The SNP would have used anything because, like I said, that is their absolute raison d'etre, the reason for being, and they will do anything to tear Scotland out of it. But what's most fascinating is that the SNP have used it in a way where they thought that there would be a greater public backlash against the UK government, against Westminster, against the UK. Because naturally, there was a lot of shock after that particular result. In Scotland, yes, did vote 62% Remain, and the local authorities, when you look at it, all were Remain. You break it down by constituency, it's different, but you look at the local authority level. And they thought that somehow that was going to cause so much grievance and anxiety that it would change, and you see this surge in support for yes, and being opportunistic, they thought, right, this is it, let's seize on the votes of all these Tories that voted to Remain as a justification to break up the union. And just after that initial period, and you saw that actually a lot of the doom and gloom that we've been told was going to happen, that George Osborne had said that literally the economy was going to collapse, you needed an emergency budget and everything else, it just didn't happen. It didn't happen, and actually we're in a very strong position. And ordinary Scots see that as well and say, actually, things are all right. I was maybe a bit panicked just after the result. What does this mean for us? But things are looking quite good. Then you look at the opinion polls in relation to who's performing well, and the majority of Scots think Theresa May is doing a better job than Nicola Sturgeon.
Yeah.
And that tells you something as well, where Scots are very content with the direction of travel and want to see the best deal from Brexit.
It's interesting. I mean, the polling is showing that there's not an appetite for another referendum. And yet, the way in which Nicola Sturgeon is ensuring that the Scottish Parliament is going to vote to have another one, but at a time we don't know exactly when, basically to foment more uncertainty and division potentially. How's about this for a left field idea for Theresa May to call Nicola Sturgeon's bluff? To call a referendum on shall we have another referendum, which I think the Scottish people say, actually, no.
I think those of us in Scotland who are unionists still need to make the argument of you do not have a mandate for this. It's unnecessary, it is unwanted, and you should take it off the table. And we need to continue to make that argument instead of falling into the trap of timelines and who will run what side of the campaign and who's going to front it up. I just think that we need to be really clear with Nicola Sturgeon that the people of Scotland don't want it. You need to act as First Minister, not just as the leader of the SNP. And then you need to do the right thing, which is look at our schools, look at our hospitals, look at our roads, and actually start doing something about it, because there are really big issues in Scotland, really big issues. And when we've actually got children leaving school who just cannot read, write and count. And we're not just falling behind the rest of the UK in that, we're falling behind Estonia and Poland. This is a country which has prided itself on its system of education, that general and broad education, and the principles behind it saying it's one of the best in the world. Yet you look at the results and it's embarrassing. It's also a country where actually fewer poorer students are going to university than here in England and also in Wales. And I think that's a mark of shame on the SNP government's record.
Do you think this entire thing, they don't actually think they're going to get an independence referendum? Because from everything you've summed up, from the European Union arguments, from the joining the Euro, the economic arguments, the current state of domestic affairs in Scotland, do you think actually they don't expect a referendum to be called and they're just hedging their bets?
Maybe I'm a little bit more cynical. I actually think that the reason we're getting this mad dash push, which seems to defy all common sense, is because they think that this is their last throw of the dice. And I think that they think that because you look at their record, and they're starting to get exposed on their record for the first time. Decade in power. And you look at the state things are in, and I would say that it's Ruth and my colleagues in the Parliament which have helped to expose that record. And they know that when it comes to 2020 general election, for example, that they are not going to return 56 seats. I think they know that they will start to lose that support, and particularly in the northeast of Scotland, where that's already been seen in council by-elections, where we saw 20% swings from the SNP to the Tories, and we took council seats in these areas. They know that they're on the downward trend, and they know that most likely in 2021, the Parliament will lose its independence majority. Now, they may still be returned as a larger party, but we don't know what's going to happen with the Greens, who are there to support them, and when Nicola says jump, they say how high. And they know that it's a really big gamble, and if they're to have it again anytime soon, then this is the time to do it. Even if it defies logic, I think they're looking further afield and thinking, if we lose a mandate in 2020 or 2021, then we're done for it. And what I find really interesting is that Nicola, and again, her conference speech, and will be saying to Theresa May that when the Parliament votes this week, on the Section 30 order for a referendum, that will must be respected. So this is this extraordinary position we're in. The First Minister of Scotland expects the Prime Minister to listen and obey to the will of the Scottish Parliament, when the SNP, nationalist Scottish Government, regularly ignores the will of the Scottish Parliament. So when they have lost votes on their education record, when they have lost votes on health, when they lost votes on the antisocial behaviour Football Act, they have ignored it. They have done it. They have not listened to Parliament. They have not respected Parliament. They have run roughshod over Parliament, and that's why it is an extraordinary brass neck then to claim that the UK Prime Minister should listen to that vote this week, when the First Minister of Scotland pays no attention to it whatsoever. In Scotland, you had 1 million people voted to leave. 1.6 million voted to remain, but still 1 million voted to leave, and that was against the odds. And when people didn't expect it, that was when you had every single party leader in the Parliament say we had to vote for Remain and campaign for Remain. The entire SNP machine, which we know is formidable, was campaigning for Remain. The entire Scottish political establishment was for Remain. And yet to achieve 1 million votes, and that shows you just how Scottish politics isn't overly representative of the people it's supposed to represent, that the Scottish Parliament itself isn't as reflective of public opinion as it should be. And you look at the Scottish National Party, and actually they themselves are not reflective of their constituents. I mean, they follow a party line, cast ironly, but they're not reflective. And that's why I was quite pleased when someone like Alec Neil, who's a SNP MSP who'd been in the cabinet previously, finally came out and said, actually, I voted to leave, and this is why I did it. Now, he might have gotten vilified from some in his own party and grassroots, but at least he had the courage to stick up for what he believed in. I wish he'd done it earlier, but he did. And most interestingly, he said that there are another 6 of his colleagues in the Parliament who did the same thing, who are still bashful, we still don't know who they are. And also there are 400,000 SNP supporters in Scotland who believe we're better off outside the European Union. So I think it's always worth bearing in mind that when Nicola Sturgeon talks about listening to the will of the Parliament, that it doesn't necessarily reflect the will of Scotland. And we always need to be careful that when we talk about Scotland, we don't make it synonymous with the SNP, because it is very, very different.
That's it for this episode of the Brexit Central podcast. If you enjoyed it, remember to share this podcast and subscribe via iTunes or SoundCloud to catch the latest updates. You can also sign up to our daily Brexit briefing at brexitcentral.com, bringing you news and analysis of the UK's departure from the European Union and promoting a positive and optimistic vision of Britain after Brexit.